So yes, this is about co-creation, innovation, and death, the future of dark tourism. So hopefully those of you who are here have a little bit of knowledge about dark tourism, but if not, that's okay, because I will introduce a little bit of it just to do a crash course for anyone who's maybe not so savvy on the topic. Or maybe you've just arrived and you have no idea what you've gotten yourself into, so you're just along for the ride. That's okay too. My name is Brianna. I'm a senior lecturer for Oxford Brookes Business School, and I teach at both postgraduate and undergraduate in the subjects of hospitality, tourism, and events. And next semester in January, I will be hosting the first running of our brand new dark tourism module for the postgraduate programs. So we're very excited about that. So this is a bit of a taster session of some of the things that we'll be talking about in that module for anyone that might be interested in what that module is about, or if there are any students here that are still on the fence of whether or not they want to join. Hopefully some of my students who have already joined the module will be here today and will find this this talk useful. So getting on into it, what is dark tourism? So essentially it is travel associated with the subjects of death, tragedy, or just the seemingly macabre. It doesn't necessarily have to be about death. And that in itself is quite a debated topic. There are lots of scholars out there who look at dark tourism as only death related, whereas other scholars may look at as something that's just related to macabre themes or historical events that may not necessarily have ended in death, but were certainly grisly in their own nature. The original term of dark tourism and how we refer to it today was coined only just a few decades ago in the 90s, in 1996, by Foley and Lennon. And they were looking at the JFK assassination and the fascination that people have with that history and the different types of spectacles that have come out of that, specifically tours, and looking at how people wanted to become involved with that history. But the act itself of dark tourism, people wanting to experience death and tragedy, is actually rooted in much older practices, going back to ancient Rome with the gladiatorial games, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a few slides. But if you look at historical acts of pilgrimage, different acts of violence that were done for spectatorship or for entertainment, these are all early forms of dark tourism. The difference being the commercialization and the commodification of these practices in the contemporary world. So it is linked to activities of thanatourism, death-related activities. And so there's a lot of death studies related to dark tourism studies. They're inherently interlinked. Within this, others have looked at the commodified packaging of dark tourism and trying to define what this is. And others have looked at it from just a historical perspective, that it has to be something that's set within history and that had some type of impact on a people, a group, or a civilization. When I was looking at it, when I was doing my doctoral research, I saw the majority of it as a form of heritage tourism. It's very much interlinked with history and heritage and culture, and therefore it's the packaged representation of past tragedy and death and the seemingly macabre. Now, in trying to identify all these different types of dark tourism, we have to look at them as an attraction. And the father of dark tourism attractions and identifying them, Philip Stone, he created in 2006 the darkness spectrum. And this has become a very common tool for people who study dark tourism to try and understand the differences in these experiences. Now, in essence, it is a darkness spectrum. And so at one end, you have the darkest places, which tend to be sites of suffering, of death. So they're in situ. They're where the actual tragedies and death took place. Generally, these places were not built for tourism purposes. They were built for other reasons, or maybe they weren't a built location. They were a natural area or an open space where tragedy occurred. Now that they've been turned into an attraction, these type of attractions will normally have a commemorative or educational agenda. They're more history-centric, and they're more concerned about the conservation of the location and the narrative itself. And so within that, there's a higher level of authenticity. There's a higher level of concern for authenticity and historical accuracy. And this goes in line with different topics relating to ethics and morality and things like that. And so in dealing with interpretation and how the history is interpreted, it is done in a much more sensitive nature. Within these locations, you also get what's called voiced participation, where people who can physically validate this history, either from having experienced it themselves or from being the descendants of people who have experienced it themselves, will be involved in the interpretation of the narrative and hopefully the design of the entire visitor experience. And so within this, you generally have a lower sense of commercialism. Things are a bit more toned down in terms of the commodified product. And so there's an overall lower sense of tourism infrastructure. Now, at the complete opposite end of the spectrum are the lightest attractions. Now, these tend to be of events that have happened in the much more distant past, and therefore, because of the temporal distance, there's a general acceptance that there's more fun and perhaps frivolity within the interpretation of these attractions. So they are more entertainment oriented. However, there are elements of lighter attractions that may be more edutainment, in which they mix education with entertainment in order to still provide that educational benefit, but in an enjoyable and fun-centric way. Now, these lighter attractions are therefore more heritage-centric. They are less concerned with authenticity. My studies have shown they're still very much concerned with historical accuracy. They want to make sure that the narrative is correct, but they understand that the history that they're delivering is often piecemeal together because of lacking evidence, or because the history is much older, and the way that stories have evolved over time, those changes come with society. So there is some speculation within their narrative of the interpretation as well. So within lighter attractions, these are obviously much more commercial. This is where you get your photograph opportunities, and you have gift shops and cafes. And we are starting to see that more and more as we move on in society. At the darkest locations, some dark locations now have cafes and even gift shops or visitor centers that offer purchased materials. So there is some crossover, and that crossover comes with the temporal distance. So as time continues to go on, some of the locations at the darkest end may slide gradually over time towards the lighter end. And so this isn't something that's set in stone. And something that Stone has said is that this also doesn't take into consideration the visitor motivations and engagement with these attractions. There are other models within dark tourism studies that have explored that and have created frameworks of which we can look at different attractions based on visitor motivations and what those experiences are. So what my focus is, and my studies mainly focuses on what Stone's done here, and it's grounded in interpretation and what the experience is, why the experience is, and what visitors might expect from it. Now, in moving on into giving you an idea of what this looks like in visual form, so dark versus light. Some of the darkest places would include any of the concentration camp that had become visitor attractions or memorial and museums, such as Auschwitz. You also have Chernobyl, which they now offer tours. And you also have, in the middle, you have gray zones. So Titanic Belfast, yes, the history is a bit more recent, but the interpretation that they've started to integrate, they've started to rely on more innovative and engaging methods to help people to understand the history of what this event was. You also have places that may be associated with a ghost story that are embedded within the local culture and community. And so they're a bit more gray. There is a sensitive feeling with these locations, as you would see with the Island of Dolls in Mexico. And then, of course, in the lightest form, you have places like the Edinburgh or London Dungeons. You have the Jack the Ripper tours, the Clink Museum, where there's educational elements within that about the history, about the event that occurred, but it is more edutainment. There is an enjoyable, entertaining side of these experiences. So that kind of shock thrill factor, and the grade of that shock fear factor will depend on what the overall purpose and agenda is of the attraction management. So in order to understand the future, we have to look towards the past. If we look at dark tourism distant past, we're talking about what Seaton was saying in terms of thanatology and looking at some of the older forms of dark tourism. This is before things became commercialized in the present day. And in looking at things like mock navy battles within ancient Rome, people came to watch prisoners of war and convicts fight to the death as a large spectacle. Now, these were very, very costly. And so in order to fill amphitheaters with water and to be able to have these mock navy battles, they would plan for these over a long period of time. And the reason for doing this is because it helped to assert the local power and authority, especially sea trade. And so it was a political agenda behind doing these. Now, this particular act didn't just exist in the ancient period. It continued throughout history. We see it again in the 1600s with mock navy Jacobean mock navy battles on the River Thames. We see it again in the 19th century in the Georgian era with showing how celebrating different victorious battles. So there is this sense of using death-related battles in order to assert one's political authority and prowess, as you will. We look also towards the late medieval, early modern period when public punishments were really in its heyday, and we start seeing people selling their windows for people to come and watch public punishments or executions. We see people wanting to participate as a spectator. There's many different textual artifacts and pictorial artifacts showing these time periods in which people were watching this spectacle take place on a stage. And there's many locations in and around a lot of old towns in the UK that have labels or blue markers showing where this is where the last execution was. And there's nearby windows that have been associated with this is where certain people would watch these executions take place. So we are seeing the sale of windows, so kind of this commodification of these death-related events taking place as early as the medieval period. And then, of course, into the early modern period, we're seeing tours of correctional facilities, people doing hard labor as a form of punishment. And the reason why that they were allowed to do tours is because it was a form of helping others to know not what to do. So it was a deterrent to help people to see this is what would happen to you if you partake in these type of activities. And in some situations, they were linked to carnival as well. So it became a part of a bigger spectacle within the community. Now, the type of dark tourism that I focus on, the more edutainment side, so the lighter side of dark tourism, it's grounded in activities that occurred in the 1700s with waxwork exhibitions. So different wax workers, the most famous, Madame Tussaud, she and her teacher, they were making different types of waxworks of political persons and helping the local community to be able to see some of the not so famous or not so popular political people of that day. And this, of course, continued into the 20th century and still exists today. Started off as Chamber of Horrors. It was about people who were known as being notorious or infamous, and now they're filled with celebrities, so you can take pictures with everyone. But the history in these are inherently linked to something much more darker. So a bit more recent past, coming into the 20th century, the London Dungeons was first opened in the 70s, and it pretty much relied on staged scenes using mannequins and props, and they were very, very graphic. If you've been to the London Dungeons now, the narrative is quite graphic and some of their props are quite graphic, but it has been in a way sanitized to be more tongue-in-cheek, where when it originally opened, it was to educate people about the severity and the graphicness of these events. And that continued into the 90s, in which, for example, Disney, of all companies, they wanted to create a theme park that would tell America's history in its truest form. Now, they wanted to educate people, but being Disney, it had to be done in an entertaining way. And they had looked to see what else was going on in the world in terms of these type of stories. And they had seen Colonial Williamsburg was starting to do reenactments of darker histories. And so they said, hey, why don't we try it as well? Now, Disney's America was never built. There were a lot of issues with it. One of them being that they wanted to have, as this picture shows, a recreation of the Civil War period. And as I quote a scholar that looked into this, that they wanted to depict slavery in all of its horribleness of its day. So it doesn't matter how many props you bring in to try and recreate this history. Nothing can quite bring it back into the way it really was. These are very horrific things that happened. And these were the conversations that were occurring around this idea of creating a theme park around very horrible histories of America's past. Also, with that, there's this element of Disney being kind of, in that period, the juggernaut of the experience industry. They had their hands in film, in television and media. They had it in theme parks. We're seeing it with Orlando growing as well. So there was a concern that for Disney to do something that had historical roots that was very sensitive and contested, that they wouldn't be able to do it well. Now, within this time period, we start seeing more reenactments coming into play. So the shootout at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona came about in the 90s as well. This was a famous gun shootout between the U.S. Marshal Wyatt Earp and his peacemakers against the cowboy gang, and it's still reenacted even now. They did take a slight stay from it for a short period of time because there were a few accidents in reenacting a shootout. So there are some management challenges in terms of recreating historic events like this. Something that is quite interesting for me because, the whole point of this talk is co-creation. And we see this come in the late 90s, and it really starts to grow in popularity in the early millennia, is programs like Follow the North Star at Conner Prairie and Fishers, USA. This is a co-created tour experience in which visitors, the audience members, participate as runaway slaves in a reenactment of the Underground Railroad. Now, this is not to create a spectacle of this and make it seem like a frivolous event. This is a learning experience. After they finish, they have a debrief in which they go through a series of questions of what they learned, how can they apply this learning to their life as they move forward. And they do Q&As about what they knew before versus what they know now, post experience, etc. And we're starting to see this type of experience become more ingrained within the dark tourism realm, as well as the wider heritage tourism realm itself. You have places like the Royal Mary King's Close in Edinburgh coming up as well. So now we're seeing character-led tours, people who take on the identification of someone who once lived in the past. You are led around by people who did have a name, who did have a presence in that physical location, and they're telling their stories about how difficult life was in the 16 and 1700s on the Edinburgh closes, dealing with the effects of the Black Death, the plague. And then you also still have remnants of the static museums. And the static museums are starting to move away from the glass boxes into a more engaged interactivity where people can participate, they can take pictures, they can pick up props, and actually reenact some of the horrific scenes that people once experienced in the past. So if we look at today, what is happening, there's so much variety, and that is all based on demand and changes in demand. So we still have the darkest of attractions, which are much more commemorative. They may offer different types of areas for reflection and for peace and just to be, in order to find oneself or to come to terms with the event that they are there to experience. You also have static museums like the U.S. Holocaust Museum. Now, they are starting to use more technology as the world becomes more technologically driven. So we're seeing lots more use of film and media and touch screens and light up features. And audio guides are becoming really, really prominent. Now, Dachau did a really interesting thing a few years back. They changed all their audio guides to be done by the voices of liberators and survivors. So again, while it's just an audio guide, it's more personal, and you're getting a more personalized experience by being able to hear the voices of the people who were involved with the actual history. So there's greater meaning in the use of technology. It's not just something to add a bit of flair. It's being used in a very strategic way to make the experience more memorable. You do, of course, in today's society still have lighter attractions that are adding the play into it. So the Titanic Museum in Branson, USA, for example, they have different interactivities, and the image I have here on the screen is one where they have platforms that are at different stages of when the ship was sinking, so that audience members, specifically children, can become more engaged with the learning experience. Sometimes children in particular require kinesthetic learning experiences to help them to understand the tragedy a bit better. It's one thing to tell a child, it's another to get them involved in a kinesthetic way so that they can really understand the gravity of what happened. You also have things like the London Dungeons, and at all of the Dungeons experiences, you have some form of ride, whether that be a boat ride and or a drop ride to simulate a hanging. So while this is a entertainment way of showing something that people had to deal with in the past, people suffered from hangings, it is something that helps people to understand the severity of it. As you're going up, you're hearing the narrative of what people might have heard just before the noose was put around their neck and they were dropped. Battle of Bannockburn is perhaps one of the most innovative things I've seen in terms of dark tourism. The things that they're doing at that memorial museum are just profound. So they've taken a museum space, they put a complete wall-to-wall, ceiling-to-floor screen in which you walk in with 3D glasses and you're immersed in the Battle of Bannockburn. In the middle, there's touch artifacts where you can push extra buttons to learn more information. And then behind the screen, there's even more touch displays where you can engage with avatar type screens where you talk to people from that time period. And then one of it, you go into another part of the museum, and it's a live reenactment of the Battle of Bannockburn, which you can choose which side you're going to be on, the English side or the Scottish side, maybe change history, but it's interactive and it gets children, again, going back to the kinesthetic learning, it gets them more engaged with the history because we are starting to see that because the world has become very screen dominated. Everyone's behind a screen, whether it's a mobile, a computer, a television screen. The world is being experienced through the screen. And so people need to be able to engage with their tourism experiences in a much more experiential way. So looking at what's happening outside of dark tourism is really important in order to understand where we're going in the future. So we know where we've come from in the past. We know that people they like to be involved with death. They like to experience something that's different from them, something that's they can't experience in their everyday life. We know that people want to be engaged. We know that people want to be able to put their hands on and experience it themselves in order to really understand the complexities and the nuances of the history that they might be learning. So looking at what's going on in tourism and hospitality, we have augmented reality travel apps. So we are starting to see this a bit in dark tourism, where you can hold up your phone or your iPad and an image will overlay in order to see what the experience would have been like at that point in time. You're seeing wearable technology. So whether it's just 3D glasses or maybe a full headgear, gloves, maybe even a full bodysuit, lots of these different things are happening in hospitality and tourism. The 360 flight simulator. So this is an example of soaring around the world in California Adventure. You also have the bird's eye view in New York. So we are seeing different rides and attractions in which people are sitting in a simulated environment that they feel like they're soaring around the world. The virtual reality is huge right now as well. So Star Wars Secrets of the Empire, I've done it. It's amazing. You feel like you're a stormtrooper or a Jedi, depending on which side you're put on. And you get to experience being in that environment by having a headset and wearing the gear and everything. So that's quite popular as well, being able to immerse yourself and then go around a room and enact whatever the theme is. And talking about theming, we also have immersive theming within both restaurants and hotels. So if you look at the Star Wars Galactic Cruiser Hotel, you assume a character from within the Star Wars environment and you're given tasks and things that you have to do within the hotel. So it's not just a place to stay, it's an engaged experience. And so it's part of the wider experience when you involve yourself within Disney. And then, of course, coming post-COVID, we have remote tourism and the hybridity of experiences that we can have. Faroe Islands was so innovative. They brought us remote tourism in which you can stay from your home and someone in the Faroe Islands will be your avatar, your sim, and walk around the islands as you tell them where to go. So these are all these great things that are happening in tourism and hospitality. And what we can do is take some of these ideas and look at how they are plausible for the future of dark tourism. So some of the things I said, we are starting to see some of those technologies in dark tourism. At Auschwitz, they are doing hybrid live tours. So these particular tours, someone who is there is guiding you around through a virtual environment through the camp, and then you can use your computer screen to do virtual overlays. The Liberation AR tour at Dachau is kind of similar, where you can go virtually within the camp, and then there's an overlay of different images that they've taken from archives. So there are some advanced and innovative technologies already starting to come in, even in the darkest locations. Looking at this in terms of maybe lighter attractions. So we are starting to see the remote tourism, the live stream tours coming in. The Lizzie Borden House, for example, they often do live streams of their tour, as well as ghost tours as well. And this really came up following the growth of ghost tourism in lockdown. There was just a resurgence of ghost tours and ghost travel shows coming back up in relation to the COVID lockdown. And so some attractions are now jumping on with that and saying, there's something here, there's a product here that we can use. Also, you have themed experiences in terms of hospitality. So the Costa Prison Hotel has been in production for quite a while, people wanting to experience what it would have been like to live in a prison hotel. And so you get the full prison experience. Now, there's a lot of prisons that are being turned into hotels, and they not necessarily have the theming in which you enact being a prisoner for your stay. It just may be the aesthetic, but that is a growing trend in its own right as well, is defunct penal institutions being turned into places of accommodation. So looking further into the future, where is all this going to play? And some predictions: remote tourism, unbodied tourism, being able to just travel from your home to different dark sites, being able to maybe even use a drone, droning through Chernobyl, and soaring through California, that soaring around the world, you could use it in order to look at the devastation of climate change or the devastation of climate change on different communities. So for example, I look at the California wildfires, and you could go through different landslides or earthquake areas. And so you're not only learning about the devastation of climate change, but also the devastation of the events themselves and what they've done to those local communities and areas. You have Paris Catacombs, which has 360 images in which you can walk through, but potentially this could be even expanded so that it's a virtual tour with a drone, or maybe like the Faroe Islands, you can walk through Paris Catacombs, or maybe walk through, for example, the US Holocaust Museum. If you can't make it all the way over there, being able to have a remote tourist experience may help to create greater awareness for people who can't travel. Taking it a little bit further, as temporal distance grows even more, we'll likely see more and more reenactment type experiences and AR and VR technologies being really pushed. So I go back to kind of the full bodysuit of the VR experience, going back to the Star Wars Jedi experience, people reenacting maybe scenes of World War I, World War II, or maybe California wildfires, enacting how it would have been like to put out a fire. Now, that's not new, though, because if we look back a few decades ago, the Universal Studios, the Backlot Tour, there used to be a backdraft from the movie Backdraft where there was a giant fire, and so people were experiencing these things already. Now what this would be is you're doing the experience, you're co-creating the experience. You're not just sitting on a car going through it and watching as a passive participant. We'll also see probably more themed dark experiences enter the hospitality realm. We're already seeing it now. Lizzie Borden House, yes, it's a tour museum. It's also a B&B. You want to stay in the house, you can. There's also different bars and different restaurants that are themed darkly or around a dark historic event. But something that's not been done that I think might be quite profitable for the company is a dungeon hotel. Now, Merlin Entertainments is expansive, and dungeon experiences are very, very popular. And they often do night overs where you can stay for the night for special events, or they might do a ghost tour where you stay the night for the ghost tour. But having a proper hotel that's dungeon themed, where your bar staff and your bellhops and your hotel staff are all themes that you would see in the dungeons experiences, I think that this might be something that we can see in the future, particularly as people become more desensitized with dark themes as a result of media, film, and television. So what the future can offer dark tourism. I think we're going to have much more memorable experiences that are going to be very hyper real, immersive, and engaging. It's not just going to be about smell pods and ambient sounds. It's going to be much more experiential, where visitors can get involved in the experience in order to connect further with history. This will help to give voices to everyday people who are often overlooked in dominant narratives, potentially giving voices to marginalized people. And that's not to say they didn't have a voice, but a lot of times their voice isn't included within the design of these experiences. And so we're going to bring real history back to life. That's what I think is going to happen in the future as technology continues to evolve. It'll allow for more tailored visitor experiences. And all of this will come into play with things like augmented reality, virtual reality becoming more advanced, more wearable technologies that are less expensive, because they are quite expensive at this point in time. And we will see more simulation rides as we move forward into the future. Now, you do have to look at, when you're talking about the future of something, the worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario would be if for some reason technology just fell, because that's where we're going. Everything is becoming technology, and everything's relying on the online. So as long as that stays, I think we'll be okay. And I think we can start to see some of these things that I've been talking about in terms of dark tourism, drawing on what the tourism and hospitality industries are already using right now, and then seeing how we can work this into dark themes as we move forward into the future. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, Brianna. Fascinating journey through bits of tourism there. It's I suppose I position myself more towards the lighter end of the spectrum, I must admit. But I kind of reflected on a couple of years ago. I went to visit. I went to America and went to Washington. And one of the museums I went into was the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I think that's the right one. But it was, you entered at the bottom and it was like a slave ship, and then you went up through the building and you went through different periods of I suppose African American history. And there was some sensitivity issues in there, and I was just wondering whether you wanted to put your thoughts on how, with some of those dark tourism examples that you were giving, how those cultural sensitivities might be managed, and the impact of those. Yeah,
so that's an underpinning topic for discussion that has been since dark tourism has come to be. How do you take someone else's suffering and tragedy and package it into an experience? And there's one thing that when I was doing my doctoral research, I had a conversation with one of the managers of the attractions I was conducting research at. And my research was about the plague and people suffering from the plague, which interestingly, I didn't realize how important it would be in today's time, having just come out of COVID. But he said something really prominent that I hadn't considered before. And maybe the reason why we poke fun at the plague in places like the dungeons and Mary King's Close and bus tours and things like that is because it was a shared experience that happened as a natural cause. It wasn't like the Holocaust or slavery, where it was put upon people. It was an oppressive thing that occurred. And so with that, you have to have, sensitivities, and you have to include the people who are a part of that history in not just the narrative development, but the experience itself. And very early visitor experiences that deal with colonialism and slavery didn't include those voices, and they are starting to now. There have been several revisions of some of the reenactments that are done at Colonial Williamsburg to ensure that they are inclusive of those voices. There was a reenactment that was done by a theater troupe led by Dred Scott that was done very well as well. So it's about coming to terms with who's telling the story why that story is being told, and ensuring the story is being truthful in the representations, and making sure that the people who are represented by the story or may have personal links or connections to the story are included in the story development. You're telling someone else's story, so you have to be sensitive when you're doing that.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. It's that's a tricky balancing act, isn't it? So we've got just over 5 minutes, I suppose. Anybody got any questions or any thoughts that they'd like to expand to Brianna? Either just come in and talk, or raise your hand, whichever, or go through the chat function.
Are any of these people students that are taking my dark tourism module?
All is quiet. So Brianna, is there something quite local to Oxford that you think is kind of prime for developing into this kind of genre of tourism?
Yeah, so Oxford has the Oxford Castle and Prison and Castle and Prison that is now owned by Continuum Attractions, which also own the Royal Mary King's Close in Edinburgh, as well as other various attractions around the UK. But it is a reenactment type tour where you're led around by a character reenactor of someone who represents that time period. They may not necessarily represent a particular person, but they're dressed in the respective time period to help set the scene. They use lots of different technologies, but it is very staged in terms of set design. You also have the Malmaison Hotel, which is a conversion property of a defunct prison, a defunct penal institution. There are lots of dark hidden histories. So the research group Torch of Oxford University, they do a hidden histories tour, and there's lots of things that you can do. There's lots of stories that I don't think people know of Oxford in particular that have the potential to do things. I'm currently working with Oxford City Council on a potential tourist experience that will involve hidden histories of Oxford. One history, for example, there is a cold case that a woman was murdered in the 1800s, and to this day they still don't know who did it. So, you know, trying to give a voice to these people who were either violently killed or suffered in some way and may have been forgotten over time, trying to bring their story to life so that we can educate people about their experiences. And within the argument of dark tourism, whether it's ethical or moral or not, you know, are you being voyeuristic and taking a story and turning it into an experience? As long as there is an agenda to educate people about it, you know, to make it a learning experience. A lot of people need a sense of edutainment or enjoyment or some kind of experiential involvement to learn more effectively.
Yeah, fascinating sphere of research, Brianna, and thank you for sharing it with us this afternoon. Going to call the webinar towards an end now, and I mentioned at the start that this is the third of 4 webinars that we've got. The final one is in a couple of weeks' time on the 8th of November, which Dr. Christian Ehrlich is talking about setting goals with happiness. So something that I'll be looking into, the number of goals and the way management has certainly moved in the last few years. So thank you, Brianna. Thank you for your time and for your insights there. Really fascinating journey and conversation. Thank you to everybody that's joined us today. Hopefully we'll have more conversations about dark tourism and all the related subjects around there in the near future as well. For those that are going on to the module next semester, best wishes for that. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. But yeah, thank you very much for joining us today, and hope to see you all soon.
If anyone wants to have a chat about it with me, please email me at bwyatt@brooks.ac.uk.
Perfect. Thanks, Brianna. Goodbye all.